Welcome to our Fifth Sixth program, and could we please give a nice cordial welcome to Delia Ray.
Thank you. So, can you show me that again? How many kids have had a chance to read the whole thing? And then who's partway through? Okay, so I'm going to make sure today that I do not give away the ending about the curse of the black angel. And I'm going to talk all about where the idea for this book came from and how I managed to figure out the mystery of who's buried under the statue. But first I wanted to take a little poll of my audience so I know who I'm dealing with. So, but you have to use your imagination. So imagine you're on a car trip this summer with your family, and you're driving out in the countryside, and your car breaks down. And when your family gets out of the car and you look around, you see an old cemetery up on the hill. And so your mom or your dad calls to find out when the tow truck can come to take your car to be fixed. And you find out that it's going to be an hour till the tow truck comes. So I would like to know what you would do during that hour. So who would go up the hill and open the gate of the cemetery and explore in that hour? Who would want to do that? Not everybody. Who would rather sit inside the car? So you wouldn't want to go in the cemetery. Well, I feel when I first started working on this project, I felt kind of odd because I've always been fascinated in cemeteries. I would have been the kid that would have been glad that my car broke down, because I would have run up that hill and spent an hour in a cemetery. But as I've been working on this project, I found out that there are lots of people and lots of kids like me who are sort of fascinated by cemeteries and graves. And I've been trying to figure out why that is. And I think it's because, to me, each gravestone represents its own little mystery. So you can look at the epitaph, which is the inscription or the carving on a grave, and get all sorts of clues by what the grave looks like, about who's buried there, when they died, how old they were when they died. Sometimes there's clues about what people have left on the graves that gives an idea. So to me, each grave is a little mystery. And so I brought slides to sort of illustrate how this project came about. And here's an example of a headstone that would be its own little mystery. So should we turn the lights down? Okay. So look at this one. Orphan girl, Angeline Moore, age 15, was found on Huckleberry Ridge. So that right there makes you ask all sorts of questions, right? Who was Angeline and why was she found on Huckleberry Ridge? So that's the reason why I grew up being fascinated in cemeteries. And so I've spent a lot of time visiting them over the years, and my kids, sometimes when we were on car trips and I would see a graveyard out in the distance, just like Lottie, the mother in my book, sometimes I would stop the car and make my kids get out and troop up to the graveyard and explore a little bit. And they would say, why? So I've had a lot of years of poking around in graveyards, but no monument or grave has sort of made me more fascinated than this grave, the Black Angel of Oakland Cemetery. So who has been to see the Black Angel? Not very many. You all are going to have to take a field trip after today because it's close by. It's just a few miles from here. So I first came across this statue by mistake. I used to live near Hickory Hill Park, and I took a jog one day and took a wrong turn. And instead of being on the trail where I thought I was, I came out in Oakland Cemetery. And if you've ever been there, it's huge. So I kept jogging and jogging, getting more and more tired, way off my route, got a little lost, and ran into this statue. And right away, I just stopped and looked at her. And I had all sorts of questions, just like that grave of Angeline Moore. She's 9.5 feet tall. The statue is black. And I wanted to know who was buried there. It's such a huge monument. If you get up underneath this angel, which isn't like the typical angel in graveyards, most angels in cemeteries are typically made out of white marble, and their heads are lifted and they're looking up at the heavens. But this angel has big drooping wings. She's black, and she looks like she's very sad, that she's in mourning. So I wanted to know why that was. I wanted to know who had cut off her fingers, because she's missing 3 fingers on one hand. And then I wanted to know about this inscription, Rodina Feldervertova. What did that mean? So I could see 2 people were buried there, Nicholas and then Teresa, who was born in 1836. But why didn't she have a death date? That right there was kind of mysterious, because that was back years ago, and when I first saw her, and I knew she couldn't still be walking around or she'd be over 100 years old, right? So that was a mystery. And then if you go around one side of the black angel, on the pedestal is this strange inscription in another language. So some of you who've read the book know what that language is, but I didn't recognize it at the time, so I had all sorts of questions. But I thought, that's interesting. Definitely wasn't thinking of it as a book idea at the time. But when I would meet people who had grown up in Iowa City, I kept asking, who is buried there and what's the story? And it was the same over and over again. People had a lot of legends and superstitions that they would tell me about. I heard that the statue was made in Italy and made of white marble and had come on the ship and fallen off. And when they managed to get it back up again, it was black. Someone said that they had heard this legend that a preacher who had murdered his son that the son was buried there, and that this terrible man had gotten away with the crime of murdering his son until one night the statue turned black as a symbol of how evil he was. So that was another story I heard, but nobody really had the information about who Nicholas and Teresa were. So it just became this interesting Iowa City landmark that I heard about, because I didn't grow up here, I grew up in Virginia. So this kind of caught my eye, and over the years I started taking my own kids to see the Black Angel on Halloween. And it became a tradition for us. And one Halloween, we went in to the cemetery and there were a bunch of people around it. And they had lit candles around her skirts, and these people were taking turns telling ghost stories. So then that became another tradition for my girls, is we would go in on Halloween and tell ghost stories. So it still was, I didn't think that I would ever write a book about the Black Angel. It didn't even occur to me until when one of my daughters was in high school, she was assigned a project for her world history class. My daughter isn't in this picture, but what these kids did in this class was the teacher had them go to a tiny little cemetery near Hills outside of Iowa City called the Morfordsville Cemetery. And what they had to do was spend the day cleaning, weeding around the graves, kind of getting all the grass, and they picked up trash. They met the cemetery keeper, and they met some family members who had relatives who were buried there and heard stories. And at the end of the day, after the kids had spent time cleaning up the graveyard, they each had to pick a grave that interested them, and then for the next 2 months, find out as much as they could about these historic graves, who was buried there. So that's what my daughter did. And it was called Adopting a Grave. So she adopted a grave of the Holmes family who had lost their infant son. And so that's how, does that sound familiar for those who've read the book? It was sort of like the Adopt a Grave project in my book. That all these kids adopted the grave, and then they went to local libraries and archives in Iowa City to try to look through the records and find out about the people, the graves that they had chosen. So when I heard that, I thought back to the Black Angel, and I thought, what if I had a character, a boy named Link, who was about 12 years old, who is assigned a project in school, like the Adopt a Grave project. Now, in my book, Link's mom, Lottie, who's kind of a crazy lady, kind of a hippie, she's got crazy hair, sort of eccentric. Link is a little bit embarrassed about her. And he goes for 7th grade. He decides to be moved from being homeschooled to go to public school. And his first project that he's assigned is the Adopt a Grave project. Well, it just so happens that Link's mom is a history professor at the university who studies graveyards. And he finds out that who's going to be leading his first field trip into the graveyard but his mom, Lottie. And the teacher doesn't know because he has a different last name than his mom. So that's how this all comes about. And Link decides to adopt the Black Angel. So when I decided to write this book, I decided I wanted to find out the real story, because even though my book is a novel and fiction, I wanted to show that sometimes the real stories behind the graves are more interesting than the legends. So the first place I started was the cemetery office in Oakland Cemetery. And when I went in and talked to the cemetery superintendent, I was surprised that they have so many visitors to see this famous Black Angel monument that they've made a brochure about her. And inside is a list of a lot of the legends. So here's just an example of what this brochure tells. Some of the legends. Touching the angel at midnight on Halloween means death within 7 years. Anyone who kisses the angel will die instantly. That's another one. And every passing Halloween causes the angel to turn one shade darker as a reminder of the people that she has killed. So in my book, I decide that Link, he's going to prove whether the curse of the Black Angel is real or not. And so he has to go to the local archives and try to figure it out. One thing I was happy that in this brochure, it did list the real people who were buried there. There's a woman, Teresa, the woman who's listed in the epitaph. So she was a mother, a single mother, who came with her son from a small village in what's now what used to be Czechoslovakia. In 1877, she immigrated to America. She had her son Eddie, who was about 5 years old when they came. But I found out that Eddie, he had become ill suddenly when he was 18 years old and died. He's buried there. And then the third person, Nicholas, was Teresa's third husband, who was a very rich man who had been a rancher in Oregon. And when he died, he left Teresa a fortune, and that is what she used to build that statue to honor her beloved son, Eddie, who died when he was so young, and her husband, Nicholas. But those were the only details that were in that brochure, and I wanted to find out more and make sure that they were true. So, like Link in my book, I started at the State Historical Society, which is right in Iowa City on Iowa Avenue, and tried to find out everything I could. And it was very frustrating, because in the beginning, I would read all sorts of newspaper articles, but once again, it was all about the superstitions and legends. And then I went back to old newspapers, really difficult to find the real information. And after I'd been working there for a while, one of the librarians said, well, you need to meet Tim Parrott. He's writing a book about the Black Angel too, which at first I was upset, because no writer wants to hear that somebody else is working on what they're working on. But once I met Tim, here he is under the wing of the Black Angel, it turned out it was a great thing. This man, his grandfather during the 1940s, for 20 years up until the 1960s, had been the cemetery keeper at Oakland Cemetery. Here's his dad, or his grandfather, whose nickname was Polly Parrott. And so Tim grew up helping his grandfather in the cemetery and hearing all the stories about the characters who were buried there. And he heard all kinds of stories about the Black Angel. And he decided he wanted to figure out who was really buried there too. And he also has written about other people buried there. He has a whole series of books. And this is what he had written when I started my research. It's called The Enigma of Teresa Feldevert. Who knows what an enigma is? Does anybody know? Enigma is mystery. So Tim had written this book. He had solved the mystery and figured out whether the curse was real. So how did he do it? How did he get these pictures? So guess what? That's Teresa. Look at her. Whenever I go into schools and I show this picture, and there's a lot of kids in the auditorium, usually there's this big, they scream because she doesn't look very nice, does she? She looks like somebody who might have put a curse on a statue. And when I read Tim's book, the more I found out about her life, the more I thought, oh my gosh, it is cursed. Not only did she lose her son Eddie, she had lost an infant son before she ever came to this country. Her first husband died, her second husband died, her third husband died, and when she moved to Oregon to work to where she met her third husband and was helping him cut hay in the field, she was bitten by a rattlesnake and had to have her leg amputated. So by the time her husband died and she came back to Iowa City and decided to build the statue, she was in a wheelchair. And people had remembered seeing her in the graveyard squeaking around in this old-timey wheelchair. So doesn't that start, it was kind of freaky, because the more I researched, I was like, yeah, it's cursed. Here was her son Eddie, what he looked like. So Tim's book was filled with all these details, and I said, how did you figure that out? Well, the reason why he figured out what no one had in all these years since the statue went up around 1912 was that Tim speaks many languages. This is how many languages he speaks. He has a translation business. That's in addition to his regular job. And he has a working knowledge of about 18 languages. And one of those languages is Czech. And that's what that epitaph is on the back of the statue that he was able to translate. And the way he solved the mystery was he went back to that same historical society that I showed you the picture of. And there, because there's so many Czech people who had come to live in Iowa City in the late 1800s, they had their own Czech newspaper. And so Tim went there and worked on microfilm. Has anybody seen microfilm before? And all the copies of that old Czech newspaper are on that film. And so he spent years going through old Czech newspapers and looking for any mention of Teresa's name, and that's how he followed her all around the country and figured out the mystery. But this is the kind of thing that he would see. And when I looked at this, I thought, how would you spend months going through all of those old-timey newspapers and then translating it? But do you see? So that's how Teresa's name looked. This was before she was married to Mr. Feldevert, Teresa Dolezal. And so this was a clue for Tim, and this is an example of what he would do. Then he would translate it. And this is what this is. So that turns out it was an ad in the Czech newspaper. It says, Teresa Dolezal, an experienced midwife. Who knows what a midwife is? Anybody?
Person who cleans and things.
No, anybody else? A midwife helps deliver babies. So that really doesn't sound like a cursed lady, does it? I was amazed when I found that out. After I had been researching and finding out these ominous things about Teresa, then I found out she had been a midwife. So she had studied at the Vienna Clinic in Austria, and this ad says that she has come to Iowa City and will help with deliveries of babies in the town as well as the countryside. So that's the kind of clues that Tim put together. And that's how I figured out about the whole history of the Black Angel. And those parts in the book are real. But once I had figured that out with Tim's help, then I got to get to the fun part of the book. And that was imagining what it would be like to be a 12-year-old boy who lived right next to Oakland Cemetery. Do any of you live near a cemetery? Anybody? Really? How far away do you live from?
Less than a mile.
So do you sometimes go in the cemetery to explore?
Not exactly because we don't really have that much time at my dad's house, but
Right. And what about you? Do you live close? 3 minutes? So you're pretty close too. Well, what if your bedroom window looked out at a cemetery? Who would like that? Who wouldn't like that? Most of you would not like that. Well, Link, in my book, because he's just grown up that way, he doesn't think very much of it. And I wanted to see what it would be like. And so I went to Horace Mann Elementary. Has anybody heard of that elementary school in Iowa City? It's very near Oakland Cemetery. And the librarian there introduced me to 3 boys who had grown up in houses like this, right next to the cemetery. And so I interviewed them about what that was like. And they had all sorts of stories about the trouble they would get into, about playing flashlight tag in the cemetery, about whether they had been brave enough to touch the black angel. One little boy told me, he said, "I kiss her all the time." And then another kid said, "I would never touch the black angel." So I got all their stories about what that was like living next to a cemetery. And then I would walk around in the neighborhoods and try to imagine the kind of house that my character Link lived in. I decided his house looked a lot like this, and maybe his bedroom was there on the right-hand side and looked out at the cemetery. And then just nearby his house was the gate, like this, into Oakland Cemetery. So I went back to the cemetery office to try to ask more questions and do research about the graveyard. And I met this man. He used to be the cemetery superintendent. So as those of you who've read the book know that Kilgore, the cemetery keeper in the book, is not a very nice guy. And he and Link have a lot of run-ins. Well, Bob was a lot nicer than Kilgore. And I made sure to say that in my author's note, that they had nothing in common. But Bob, he got used to me hanging out in the graveyard and coming by and asking him all kinds of questions, because I wanted to know, how do they dig graves? That's what it looks like. And those boards are over the space where they dug the grave. I had always wondered, how do they dig a grave in the winter when the ground is frozen? Does anybody know that? They could use a bulldozer, but it'd be difficult if the ground was really frozen. But I found out they use something called a grave defroster. So they wheel this over the grave, and this can melt about 1 inch of soil per hour. So in the dead of winter, no pun intended, they wheel these defrosters in, and it can take up to a week to melt the soil so that they can dig the grave in the wintertime. So I wasn't sure whether I would use that kind of information in my book, but all those kind of questions and interviews with people who worked in cemeteries gave me ideas. Even looking at the signs in Oakland Cemetery made me come up with one of the ideas for a scene in my book. So look at all the rules. It says, owners don't want you to walk, jog, or drive, obviously. Cemetery rubbings aren't allowed. Do you know what cemetery rubbings are on gravestones? What?
It's like you take a piece of paper and a crayon, you put it against something that you know.
Right, to get the impression of the graves.
I know how they did this a long time ago, and I think a lot, they used chalk, black chalk, and they rubbed it over.
Right, but some people believe that graves can be damaged by doing those rubbings. So in Oakland, they're not allowed, and they have all sorts of rules about decorations, holiday decorations, that when they can be there and when they can't. So that became the basis for scenes in my book. And then I would wander around and look at the things that people left on graves. There's one section of Oakland Cemetery that used to have its own gate around it and was called Babyland, just like the section that is talked about And here lies Link, where all the children and infants are buried. And so when you go there, it's sad, and especially when you see the things that people have left around there. I had never heard of a columbarium wall before I started researching for this book. And a columbarium wall is where they put the ashes of people who have been cremated in little compartments there. And in my book, Link finds out when his father has passed away and that his mother, Lottie, has going to put his father's ashes in one of these walls. And Link is very upset because he just wants a traditional gravestone. Then I learned that people can put flowers on the columbariums in those compartments. So when this picture was taken was when this wall was pretty new at Oakland Cemetery. Now a lot of those different compartments have names on them. I also had been fascinated with mausoleums. Does anybody know what a mausoleum is? It's like this. For when people were wealthy and they wanted to honor their loved ones who had passed away, sometimes they would build a huge tomb like this. And there are several of these, maybe 2 or 3 in Oakland, that caught my eye. And they became the basis for a scene in Here Lies Link because one of Link's person that he becomes friends with in the book, for his Adopt a Grave project, decides to adopt the ransom vault. And so Link, because he wants to be popular in junior high, and because he lives close to the cemetery and is friends with one of the workers in the cemetery office, tells his friend Melliker that he can get him a key to get inside this vault. So then I had to go back to that cemetery office and ask Bob I said, can you show me where you keep all your keys? And he took me to this little closet where he kept them, and I told him a little bit about my book, and I said, would it be possible for a 12-year-old boy, say if people were busy or out of the office, to sneak in the back closet and maybe snatch a key to one of the vaults? And Bob said, no way, that could never happen. But one day when I went to ask Bob some questions, and he wasn't in the office, in fact, no one was, they were all mowing or in the tool shed, and I went in there, no one was there, and I decided just to do a little experiment. So I sort of shuffled over to the closet, and my heart was beating so fast I felt just like Link because I didn't want to be caught. And I shuffled over and I pushed, I can't believe when I'm being taped saying this. I pushed the door open to the cemetery office closet, and I ran in, and I didn't take the key off the hook, but I touched it just to prove that Link could have gotten the key to give to his friend Melliker to get into the vault. And so I won't tell what happens since some of you haven't read the book, but that's a big scene in the book about what happens in the ransom vault. I also found out there's lots of rules about pets in graveyards. No pets allowed. And I ended up, in the time that I was working on this book, there were 2 different cemetery superintendents, and they both said that is the thing that made them most angry. When people would bring their pets in, because sometimes, you know, they do their business in the cemetery, and it was actually the cemetery superintendent before him talked about this man who would come in every morning in his truck, let his dog out, close the door of his truck, and then roar all the way through the cemetery so his dog could get the exercise all the way through Oakland Cemetery. And they were after him and they wanted to catch him. I don't think, they finally had to get a restraining order or something like that. So I started thinking, what if Link has a dog? And I happen to have a great dog named Griffin that I adopted about 13 years ago from the animal shelter, and I've been trying to find a way to get Griffin into my book, one of my books, and this was my chance. So this is what my dog looks like. Isn't he funny? So that becomes Link's dog in the book, but his name is CB. And so that's how Link first gets into trouble with Kilgore, the cemetery keeper, because he takes CB for a walk and CB gets loose, and that's how they first meet. So as you can see, here I am with my kids and their cousins and Griffin one night in the cemetery. So he's had his own adventures there. So when we got to the stage of the book where the artist was making the cover, at first the cover of the book didn't have a dog. It just had Link and Delaney, and there was no dog there. And so the more after I thought about it, and I thought, gosh, Griffin has to make an appearance on that cover. So I asked if he could be on there, and they said yes. And so the artist kept sending sketches, and I kept saying, scruffier, scruffier, because my dog is kind of scruffy looking. Still, I think the dog on the cover is lots kind of cutesy, kind of like Benji, the dog in the movies, more than Griffin, but I'm still happy with it. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about epitaphs on graves, inscriptions, because that also became an important part of my book. Like I said in the beginning, when you read those messages on the gravestones and you can think about solving a mystery, this is one of the first graves that I saw in Oakland Cemetery. You can see that Johnny Hendricks is buried there, and he was a drummer, it says. And look at the years when he was buried. He lived from 1853 and died in 1865. So who knows how Johnny might have died?
From being a drummer in the Civil War?
Right. She said from being a drummer in the Civil War. And that's exactly right, because the Civil War, and that's kind of sad that Johnny died at the end. That was the last year of the Civil War at 12 years old. So the more I read epitaphs and studied them in other graveyards around the country and the world, the more I thought I would like to begin each chapter in my book with a real epitaph, just because they're so interesting. And at the time, I didn't realize how difficult that would be, because I had to come up with 30-some of real epitaphs that would make sense to kids who are reading my book. So I brought along some epitaphs, some of my favorites of the ones that I found. So these are blurry, so I'll read them to you. This is Wayne Strickland, and his epitaph says, "I am a busy man. I don't have time for this." Did you just open to that? So that made it into the book. I'm not sure if this one is in there, but Anne Jean Sharp, hers says, "Why look ye here? I am way up there." Joan Hackett says, "Go away, I'm asleep." So here's one. I don't think this is in the book, but I like this one. This is out west. Robert Clay Allison, his says, "He never killed a man that did not need killing." Eric Jr. says, "I made a lot of deals in my life, but I went in the hole on this one." Get it? And I like this one. Murphy Dreyer, "This ain't bad once you get used to it." And my all-time favorite, Isabel's, "I'd rather be at the mall." Yeah. That's a great one. So sometimes when I go and talk to kids, it seems a little bit morbid, but they want to talk about what they would put on their gravestone or what pictures they would have. And so sometimes we talked a lot about that. It's interesting to think about. So that's all I have. We have about 5 minutes for questions, if anybody has any.
I actually want to be an author myself. I'm not in 5th or 6th grade. I'm just here with my sister. But it's just, how do you get all these ideas for these books? I mean, it's so interesting.
Great. Could everybody hear that? She's saying, where do I get ideas for my books? Well, usually it's just like this. People that I meet, an idea. Sometimes reading in the newspaper. My new book came from a newspaper article. And this, The Black Angel, I never thought that jog would turn into, eventually lead to a book idea.
Yeah, sometimes you get it from dreams I heard. I mean,
Right.
like the Twilight series was in a dream.
In a dream, yeah. Dreams, just current events, family members. I wrote a book called Singing Hands that's based on my mom's childhood. She grew up a child of deaf parents. My grandparents were deaf and had 4 hearing children. And my whole life, I listened to my mom's stories about the mischief she would get into and what it was like growing up with deaf parents. And I never thought that would be a book. And then, one day, and she would tell my kids stories. And one day when we were on a long car trip, and she was telling stories, she grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and it suddenly occurred to me, that would be a great book. So that's where that came from.
Did the 3 college students really lose their hand?
So he said, did the 3 college students really lose their hand? He's talking about one of the legends about these boys who cut the fingers off of the Black Angel is what happened to each of them. And that one of the ones who had done that for their fraternity initiation had lost his hand. I heard that story a lot. I don't think it's true. But I also met a man who has a friend who said, or he told me, I know where 2 of those fingers are, the Black Angel fingers. And he told me that his friend has them in his house in a velvet-lined box. Strange. But that's one of the legends about the Black Angel. I like to think that that is not true.
What's your favorite character?
So she's asking, what is my favorite character in the book? Well, I really like Delaney a lot, that character. So Delaney is a new girl at the school where Link is also new, and they become friends, and she adopts a grave, the Robert Raintree grave. And what she finds out about her grave helps Link solve a mystery about his own roots and his own family members. And so I like Delaney a lot.
Is Delaney's grave a real grave?
And so she's asking, is Delaney's grave a real grave? If you look in the book, there's a map there. And a lot of kids have gone into Oakland Cemetery and tried to follow the map. And they've asked me, I couldn't find the Raintree grave. And I'm kind of disappointed, but that part of the book is fiction. All the Black Angel parts are true, but those parts are fiction. So Link's house, the house that when I go to Oakland Cemetery and walk around it, I've picked out the house where he lives. I've met the people who live there, but all of that is sort of came from the imagination.
How big is the Oakland Cemetery?
So she's asking how large is Oakland Cemetery. I'm not sure of the acreage, but it's huge. So I just led a field trip of kids there a couple weeks ago, and we were walking around for a couple hours. It's big. And there's a beautiful old part and then newer parts. And it's interesting to walk through and see how the graves have changed, and to see the columbarium wall, and to go see the Black Angel. Any other questions? Well, you guys have been a great audience. I'm excited that a lot of you got the book, and I think that we're going to have a drawing, right, to give away some others.
Thank you, Delia. That was wonderful.
Hi, I'm Delia Ray, and I was here today at the Coralville Public Library to speak about my book, Here Lies Link, for the summer reading program. Read my book.